one nation under fire.
I was in upstairs B hall in my astronomy class. My teacher's face just went pale. Like, I've heard this alarm I never heard before. I just wanted to be home in that moment. I wanted to be home with my family and my dog. When our teacher told us to run, I had to run down the stairs. We were walking on people's ankles, basically on their shoes, like on their legs too as well. It was terrifying. Like, I would say like 200, 300 students were just trying to go down the stairs and like pushing each other, screaming to move. I just remember trying to get out of there and just hoping that I wasn't gonna get shot. It feels more than like just fear. I think it was just acknowledgement that these could be my last moments.
Officers are responding to an active shooter situation.
Maryland, when somebody opened fire this afternoon.
11 people are dead after a shooting at a public works building.
I want to know that where my child is
killed Audrey Hale.
We're normalizing trauma. We're normalizing gun violence.
It feels like our children's lives are expendable.
I believe are experiencing complex PTSD.
I don't even feel like myself.
As a state, we are dealing with the largest mass shooting in our state's history.
America's gun violence epidemic continues to hurt and traumatize young lives. As of late June, more than 3,000 American children and teenagers were killed or injured by gunfire this year alone. That's according to the Gun Violence Archive. Public health experts are increasingly labeling it a disease. It continuously makes headlines without substantial changes to federal policy to proactively save lives. This is one nation under fire.
This was the table I was underneath when everything happened.
An American reality, far too common.
I blocked out everything that happened, so I don't really even remember kids just running. Like, that's just more of a thing. I just remember hiding under the table, running outside. Okay, I'm outside the school right now.
Yeah, you didn't get too squished in the stairwell, I hope.
I
know Mike said it.
I think it was worse at the very beginning because students were actually walking on each other's limbs. Like, I remember walking.
An accidental alarm going off and a swatting call happening within weeks of each other.
That's the thing with those false alarms. I mean, you want to get out,
but then I look at it.
I saw people tripping.
You did?
And I didn't leave till everyone else got out, and then I was like, okay, everyone's gone. Me too.
Yeah, I know
Sending this Massachusetts community spiraling, triggering a world of hurt for this young generation.
When we are ready to transition, we will let everybody know.
I honestly thought that I was going to hear like a first round of gunshots. I honestly thought I was about to witness hearing people like die basically and having to hear gunshots. That was really traumatic. But like, yeah, this is mostly when it was really bad right here. This is when a lot of kids were like walking on top of each other. Well, I ran home basically, and like when I got home, I actually started to throw up like spit. My lungs were burning, and like even after 3 days afterwards, like my lungs were completely burnt. It hurt to like breathe, or like some ways. It did really hurt. Like even though it was false, it did affect my body in a negative way. Like I was in pain in some ways.
My daughter called me on her cell phone, frantic and running out of breath. And she says, "Dad, there's been a shooting in the building, there's been a shooting in the building." And I'm like, "Calm down." I didn't know at that time if she was still in the building or where she was. And luckily I got her to tell me where she was. I just calm, but getting that phone call was probably the most terrifying thing that I experienced in my life as a father and a former school committee member, because you should feel safe going to school. And what's happening now, these kids don't feel safe. They have their backs wondering, like an incident like that, is it real, is it not real? It's sad.
3 fake gunshots. Go. In room 138. Janita Pilgrim, with her hands still raised, told me this was all too real.
It's scary.
Is it?
Yes.
Even though it's fake, it's still scary?
Yeah, it's still scary to think that there are people out here that would do this, to come into a school and do this to innocent people.
In America, at least 40 states require active shooter drills. Olivia's home state is among the few not mandating them.
You can never go wrong with a culture of preparedness, but there's tremendous inconsistency in active shooter drills. They're not all the same. So they can be effective, but the most important thing is that the adults who are charged with executing the plan can maintain calm and continue to follow the protocols in the event an incident occurs.
Within the span of a decade, public schools have primarily turned to active shooter trainings as early as preschool in an effort to keep children safe, while also leaning on other tools like AI-powered advanced weapons screening and bulletproof whiteboard-safe rooms. Framingham schools had already started training staff in ALICE protocols before the pandemic halted the training for students.
I know you don't want to cause more trauma, but how can receiving training be more traumatic than thinking I could die?
Leaving students to publicly request the training after both incidents.
Students or parents could opt out if they don't want to relive any of this trauma. At the end of the day, every second counts, so we need to make the most out of those few seconds. This is becoming everyday life. We can't change the way things are going, but we can at least put in measures for the safety of our schools. Home is a place where I know I'm the safest, where I won't get shot. School is supposed to be a safe place. She loves people.
The mental health impact those same drills could be having on children remains a controversial topic.
No two people are going to have the same reaction. So some students will go through a training and be fine with it and learn from it, where others will be traumatized by it or shook. The studies about the drills are very inconclusive. There's not one strong theme that runs through them all, that we definitely have to do X or definitely do Y.
The concerns extend to the overall societal impact.
I do feel we've normalized gun violence, and it's a very sad state of affairs. The children that we're working with here in our clinic have accepted the fact that there isn't necessarily a safe space anymore, especially going to a mall, going to a concert, and yes, even going to school. And it's having a definite impact on children's psychology, perceptions of the world, as it should. It's not an unfounded threat. It's a very real threat.
Experts say gun violence in America is not one problem, but rather multiple separate but related problems. Gun-related deaths are broken down in two main categories: suicides, accounting for 54% of deaths, and homicides making up 43%. Mass shootings, defined as 4 or more people killed excluding the shooter, account for 1 to 2% of all gun deaths. Domestic gun violence, heavily impacting women, with 64% of female firearm homicide victims being killed by handguns. And community gun violence, disproportionately affecting Black and brown communities, making up less than a third of the U.S. population, but accounting for 3/4 of gun homicide victims.
We need to make it harder for criminals and people who would misuse guns and use them unlawfully to get them. So we need to regulate access to guns better. Another thing we need to do is we need to properly support our law enforcement personnel who are trying to address gun violence. We also need non-law enforcement solutions, community-based solutions to address gun violence. We also need to make sure that people who are involved in domestic violence can't easily get their hands on a gun. And finally, there's a bunch of things that we can do to potentially limit the lethality of mass shootings. Things like assault weapon bans or reducing the size of magazine clips.
Firearms have become the leading cause of death for children under 18 in America, according to CDC data, with 19% of deaths attributed to gun-related incidents.
I'll be completely honest, I don't really know what the right solution is, but I feel like the first step is to at least admit that and have a conversation. I talked to one of my friends about this actually. We're talking about how this is training mass shooters, but then we also talk about on the bright side what this is helping a student to learn how to hide or learn how to barricade, or if this makes them feel more comfortable going to school. What's the sacrifice that needs to be made in some ways? And I feel like we need to start talking about that more, of what we can do.
Olivia is leaving high school behind, but she will march on to the tune of what brings her the most joy.
This is the one place I know where I have my best friends, and I have a really amazing teacher that I wouldn't sacrifice that. That was the only reason why I honestly came to school in some ways, just to be in this classroom. It's honestly my whole entire life. I couldn't imagine life without it. It's just helped me out so much. through depression and just like growing as a person. It's just like, it's all come back to band. I've been talking to one of my therapists, and like, I have been starting to accept that I'm starting to become way too hyper aware of my surroundings to the point I'm paranoid about where I am, basically, because I'm so scared being out in public places. But I also don't want to give, and I also want to live my life, and I don't want to be in my room worrying 24/7.
It's just a reminder sometimes that I'm not alone. It is a part of my call and my ministry. This has been a 4-decade issue. My siblings and my uncle were killed in the late 80s and early 90s. And here we are right now, still facing the same issues, still facing this issue of gun violence. And it's just not a singular issue of mass shootings, because communal gun violence has been going on in Black and brown communities.
There was not one pull of the trigger. There were not 2 pulls of the trigger, 3. There was clear intent there.
Nearly 400 kids under 18 years old were arrested for violent crimes in 2022.
The 77 illegal guns pulled off of D.C. streets this week. Handguns, ghost guns, even that rifle right there.
They described what they heard was about 30 shots fired, some of them running outside to make sure that their loved ones weren't among tonight's victims.
Just 11 miles south from Washington, D.C.'s National Cathedral.
Raise your hand if you've heard gunshots. I heard gunshots too.
No, you didn't.
Oh, you can't tell him what he heard and what he didn't.
The Trayron Center provides refuge to kids surrounded by gun violence.
Where do you feel safe?
At home.
At home? At camp?
In the house.
In the house? Where you feel safe? You feel safe in a different state? Why? Why? It's too much? What's too much?
Because there's a lot of shooting.
It's a lot of shooting?
Yeah.
Don't say he hasn't heard it.
Raise your hands if you all have lost anyone due to gun violence, like they passed away. Okay.
Part of the program's after-school approach is focused on having difficult conversations while using art as an outlet.
PTSD can be a one experience situation, right? And for other individuals, complex PTSD is when it is a prolonged occurrence of various traumatic events. I believe that these kids are experiencing complex PTSD. One student literally just shared with us that she was upset about her father passing, and he had passed away maybe 3 months ago, if that. And she openly shared that in front of the group, and she's maybe like 5. She became very hyper aware of sounds during that time, like making sure like, oh no, like I can't go outside because they're shooting, or I didn't really sleep because it was shooting in my neighborhood last night.
Children far too young, navigating a challenging upbringing.
Let's see. For some of them, this one is southeast, this one is northwest. This one is Alabama Avenue, MLK Junior Avenue. Still trying to figure out like what happened, if anyone saw anything or anything like that.
A present reminder of the violence around them.
For some of them, their reaction is just like, oh yeah, like it happens, which is understandable, right? Desensitization. And for other students, it's just like, no, like this is happening, like this is real.
Another shooting also on Stanton Road put a school on lockdown yesterday.
Parents walked their children home along a street littered with shell casings.
Yes, it's the illegal guns that make their way into our city. Thousands confiscated every year, like clockwork. What's behind that person pulling the trigger? Is it trauma? Deep trauma that has gone unaddressed? Is it generational poverty where that person sees their only outlet as in taken from somebody else and there are no other options?
Only adding to the frustration, the fact that D.C. has strict gun laws.
Guns are not manufactured in Washington, D.C., and there are no gun stores here in the district.
It's a combination of guns and people. There is a saying within the gun violence prevention movement, it's the guns. And absolutely right when you talk about mass shootings, it's the guns. But when you talk about communal gun violence, it's the guns and broken systems.
What we saw during the pandemic was a very large surge in the purchases of legal guns. Now, those guns are originally in the hands of law-abiding citizens. But unfortunately, during the pandemic, a surprisingly large fraction of those guns were either lost or stolen and found their way into the hands of criminals. In criminology, we call this the time to crime. And unfortunately, for a large fraction of the guns that were purchased during the pandemic, the time to crime was very short, less than 6 months.
Some of them are stealing them and selling them for the highest bidder. Some of them are keeping them. Some of them are storing them in their house. Some of these firearms are kind of community guns where they're going from one person to the next because they know there's a stolen entity there and there's no registration for the firearms. So they're just using them, and then once they're done with them, they try to get rid of them and sell them to somebody else so that person can then illegally use these firearms.
In D.C., 86% of homicide victims and suspects were previously known to the criminal justice system. About half of them had previously been incarcerated.
As we look at the rise in crime across the nation and in our city with young people, it's because we are not attending to their basic needs. We are saying to parents, we can't help your children until they touch the criminal justice system. And that's just wrong for a parent that sees their child going down the wrong way and is reaching out to get help.
What we know is that individuals who grow up around violence are more immune to it. So there have been numerous studies that have shown that a lot of children from underprivileged areas in America with a lot of gun violence have very similar symptoms to children who came from foreign countries who grew up in war zones.
Kids committing crimes, getting arrested for things like armed robbery, carjacking, and yes, even murder.
It's horrible, it makes you wonder, what have we done wrong? Are we not listening to our kids? Are we not sending the right message?
Ryan remains committed to her mission, her ministry, and faith in her children.
If you're able to change the narrative of a child, you can change the narrative of a generation. And that is what I seek to do, and that is what we seek to do at the Trayvon Center, is change the narrative for a child and a family, that they do not become consumed by the violence they see in their communities, but they surpass it.
Democrats in the House plan to pass a package on gun reform laws that is all but certain to stall in the Senate.
Seem to do very little to bridge the partisan divide over gun reform and gun rights.
The gun rights lobby has become increasingly powerful. Right front and center is the NRA, but there's another organization reaching deep into their pockets.
Introduce people who've never shot a gun before to what it's like to shoot.
Why do you need people that didn't shoot a gun?
Well, because we got to teach them how to shoot.
The National Shooting Sports Foundation has been aggressively spending on federal lobbying.
We have an office a couple of blocks from Capitol Hill, so we have our finger on the pulse of what's happening. There are a lot of things that have not happened due to our efforts that you may never hear about.
Their social media presence, a staunch defense of the Second Amendment. While gun control groups are continuously outbid by the gun rights lobby by millions. In the years since Columbine,
what more we can do to try to prevent these things from happening.
Sweeping policy-driven solutions.
When that sanctuary is violated, the impact is felt in every American classroom and every American community.
Have had little success being passed.
The majority of those who died today were children. Beautiful little kids between the ages of 5 and 10 years old.
With firearms becoming more accessible.
It is not enough to simply take actions that make us feel like we are making a difference. We must actually make that difference.
I had hoped when I became president I would not have to do this again. Another massacre, Uvalde, Texas.
We were 6 years old when a 20-year-old gunman killed 20 first graders and 6 educators with an AR-15 in Sandy Hook Elementary School, a school not far from our home. We knew then that if it could happen in Sandy Hook, it could happen anywhere.
I think it's important to recognize that this is going to be a long struggle over multiple generations. There is one policy solution that would reduce all forms of gun violence at the same time, and that's gun licensing or permit to purchase. And that's a very simple idea. We license people to drive cars, and we could also license people to carry guns, particularly handguns. It's a simple idea. It's done in some states, but not in others. But we should do it more often.
Rarely has the Second Amendment been more necessary to secure the rights of our fellow citizens.
Because of the political impasse, because of Republican obstruction, the broader solutions, the legislative solutions, the long-term solutions are going to be harder to implement in the short term.
That was the indoor show, and I'm towards like the end right there. One of my biggest fears is I'm gonna go off to college, I'm gonna look down at my phone, and I'm gonna see that my old high school or any of the public schools got shot up, and that would truly break my heart. The way this country is going, in some ways there's shootings basically every day, that it's just valuable to know those trainings. And like, it's starting to become everyday life, but not only that, for all my underclassmen, because like, I want them to enjoy high school. I don't want them to have to go to school every day fearing if they're gonna be killed or not. Like, that's truly why.
Until then, America's next generation will continue to challenge and redefine what it means to be safe.
Yes, you have a question? Whoever shoots, they need to get out. Raise your hand if you want the people who shoot gone.
They need to move somewhere else and shoot.
They need to move somewhere else and shoot. So like have their own little space.
The solutions to America's gun violence problems are among the country's most divisive issues. Advocates continue to call for universal background checks, age limits, and a ban on high-powered rifles. But some disagree, standing firmly by the Second Amendment. And more Americans are turning to gun ownership. From 2019 to 2021, 7.5 million adults acquired guns for the very first time. That's according to the American College of Physicians, potentially exposing 5 million children with firearms in their homes.